Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new Delta X podcast with Ellen Shu. These are conversations with changemakers, innovators, and self-starters who have made their mark on the world at a young age, breaking down the journeys of those who are changing the status quo and building the future today. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
And welcome back to Delta X Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Shu, and today I'm really lucky to have a mentor of mine and also a mentor of many others come on the show. If you listened in on previous episodes, you know that Delta X Podcast is all about technology, startups, and innovation. And luckily for us, Nikin has experience in all three, as you'll soon hear about. He discovered he had a talent for electronics at 9 years old, and he was the youngest research assistant at India's Department of Defense. After which he got a full scholarship to attend Northeastern at 16 years old. He co-founded Medtech, a Medtech startup focused on post-operative recovery management, which he is now working on full-time as co-founder and CEO.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here.
I noticed from your extensive background that a common theme is using technology to launch ventures and impact lives. And this was started from really early on, right, since you were 9. How did you catch this entrepreneurship bug, so to say?
I think what my parents definitely instilled in me at a very young age was a love of reading. So I used to spend my allowance growing up in Bangalore, India, we used to call it pocket money. So I used to spend my pocket money on books primarily. And they themselves, each of them are doctors. One is a medical doctor, another a PhD. So very much into more academic education, but definitely they instilled in me and my brother a love for reading. So I started reading a lot of STEM books, so science, technology, engineering books. And specifically what really interested me were biographies, right? And stories of innovators, scientists, and inventors, and specifically stories of Edison, right? So Edison, Einstein, childhood heroes really, and a little later Steve Jobs, but those stories drew me in and really inspired me, because in Edison's case, right, he started experimenting, doing science experiments when he was a kid, right, in a railway carriage, I think, where he had a job as a newspaper boy, like someone who sells newspapers, and that got me really interested into science, into experiments, into technology. So I would say and he kind of became my inspiration, right? But and how that originated was definitely a love for reading, which my parents instilled. And then it was kind of my own journey to investigate like different topics, different books, and find a few heroes from that, right? People I could emulate. And we did have resources in our neighborhood too. So where I grew up in North Bangalore, so a lot of defense institutions. So we have the Indian Space Research Organization there, a lot of the Indian Armed Forces, so the Border Security Force, the Air Force, and also the Army. And you just had this huge concentration of research labs, and primarily geared towards defense. And one of my neighbors ran an electronics lab for the Border Security Force, and was kind enough to give me access to the lab when I was, I think, 7, 8 years old. Initially for the summer, then I started spending just so much time there. So weekdays, on the evenings, in the weekends, and I just grew fascinated by all things electronics. And all the students there were undergraduate level or graduate level, and I just started soaking up as much as I could. So initially, I didn't have the training in math or physics to understand the textbooks, right? But I very quickly could gather or begin to understand the practical side. So I was definitely started to help the students out, right? So if the professor had stepped out, they're doing a lab experiment, they were stuck, right? And I was like, hey, I've seen this, right? Happen 10, 15 times. So I can show you a demo of how this works or answer a few of your questions. And then later, as a result of that, just to understand the math and the physics side, the equations, I ended up on my own through Khan Academy and through other sources, learning that component specifically. So that's how an interest in technology really developed for me. And also, you could say scientific innovation generally.
Yeah, that's really amazing too, how, reading books really got you inspired and you had so many role models in these different biographies that you've read. I also read Steve Jobs' biography. I thought it was so inspiring and just like it really changed my mindset about how to look at problems and how to work on really impactful things. So yeah, I haven't read Edison's though, so I'll definitely need to check that out. But I think that's really great how you're able to, foster that at a really young age through your love for reading. And so as I noticed that later on, a few years later, you enrolled in university at 16. And as someone who's currently 16, I find that super impressive. So I guess what drove and influenced your decision to kind of accelerate your path to education and higher education, college?
That's a very good question. It's because when I was in that electronics lab and I was very fascinated with the technologies, with electronics, I was picking up. So over the course of a few years, I ended up having a role to play in many of the projects that were there. Many of them were national level defense projects and a mix of military use cases and civilian use cases. And it ranged from, just train announcement systems at railway stations, automated train announcement systems, to an agricultural system for farmers. So you could get your crop prices on your SMS and also control your pumps, your irrigation pumps through SMS. Again, this was early 2010, so 2009, 2010, 2011. So before smartphones, right? And especially in a developing country, those technologies came or penetrated way later than developed countries. So we were still using, phones with the keypads where and SMS was the mode of communication, right? Mm-hmm. So we used those technologies, and this was in the very early stages of Internet of Things as well, where you could make anything smart, right? You can make your fridge talk now, you can make your Microsoft and washing machine, everything communicate with each other, talk. But this was in the very early stages of that, where if you had to make something smart, you needed a small suitcase size system installed there, right? You needed modem, trans receivers, you needed relays, integrated circuits. And even the sizes of those components was fairly large. So very early days of IoT, and this is pre-smartphone. So we created these systems with essentially the technologies we had available at that time. And also my math and physics education were becoming much more advanced than my grade at school. So all this led to me advancing in my own time of many years ahead of what was being taught in school at that time. And it came to a point that I think in 7th grade, I was just too bored to go to school, right? And I kind of gave an ultimatum to my parents, which is I just can't go to school, like not another day, right? It's not stimulating me, it's not challenging me, right? And again, they were willing and kind enough and big-hearted enough to recognize that. So we ended up deciding to drop out and essentially be homeschooled, right? And I had that opportunity for 2 years before I essentially drew them crazy, and they're like, Nikin, we just can't take this anymore. We have to go back to school. So I had a period of time when I was homeschooled, and then I went back to school for 11th and 12th grade. But what ended up happening is, so 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, so what was supposed to be 4 grades, instead became just 2 grades for me. So I essentially ended up skipping 2 years in that process. Again, I wouldn't, looking back, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, since it just takes, especially on the family, right? On your parents, it just takes an incredible toll, because everyone around me follows a traditional path. and you do have feedback from your peers, friends, neighbors, right, society at large, as to what would happen if your kid isn't affiliated with an education institution, right? Aren't you thinking about his future? And I think the challenge that my parents definitely had explaining is it's because he doesn't fit. I mean, he's already ahead of his grades. He just doesn't fit. He's not a good fit there. So I would say, not to point fingers, but the Indian education system, it is very traditional and very rigid and structured. And I'm pretty sure if I was in school here in the US, from what I've seen over the past 7 years, being here is I would have been kept challenged, because there are just so many extracurricular activities that you can do. And you do have separate tracks, right, for people who can accelerator tracks, for people who can soak up more information. So it was kind of because of the system too. And that being said, wonderful experience being homeschooled those 2 years, right? You just have complete creative freedom on what to pursue. So I did a lot of electronics, picked up some programming too, and then just read whatever in terms of reading. And I just read whatever I was very passionate about. And then back to school for 11th and 12th grade, which again, I was like, man, counting my days till I got out of there, right? It's a little stressful, right? Because you feel like you're in a race against everyone else, right? And it is a win-lose scenario. And what I mean by that is, for you to get an admission seat, someone has to lose out, right? So it's not a win-win scenario. And that just creates, I think, a very toxic environment, a very competitive environment. And many people, instead of focusing on self-improvement, they focus on how do I beat the competition, so to speak, right? How do I become the first rank in my school? So all of those things, I was definitely not a fan, right? And that led me to exploring opportunities to study abroad. And the other part of it was I had already finished the undergraduate and graduate curriculum of electrical engineering in Indian universities.
And how did you do that? Did you take classes online or?
So I was still going to the electronics lab, right?
Uh-huh.
So, and they had all the course textbooks. So from the first semester to undergrad, all the way through graduate school. So I kind of finished all the textbooks, finished all the practical components as well. Because in this lab, they did research, but a lot of students came to do their practical lab experiments too. Like, for example, in your second semester of your third year, you'd have a set of experiments to do, right? So they came to that lab to do those experiments too. So I kind of got exposure to the academic, the practical work, along with their capstone projects, right, of undergrad and graduate students. So I knew the problem would happen again is once I got into a university in India, is I probably wouldn't be challenged. So definitely try universities outside of India, where you do have more creative freedom. You can pursue other research endeavors and other extracurricular activities. And there were two in my high school of class of 120. There were maybe 2 or 3 applying for undergraduate admissions abroad. I didn't have a high school counselor. I pretty much followed their lead, right? Like they had counselors, right? So they paid good money to get those counselors who helped them prepare great essays, had a schedule with, hey, this is when you have to take your SAT the first time. And if the score's not so good, the second time. And this when you have to take your ACT. So they were prepared. They had like a timetable. And I just used to talk to them in the high school cafeteria, right? Like, hey, what are you up to now? Right. And he's like, yeah, I'm actually preparing for the SATs like 2.5 weeks from now. Then I went home, Google, what are the SATs? How do you sign up for them? I'm like, okay, after the SATs, what do you do? It's like, yeah, you prepare your essays. So kind of just my high school guidance counselor was my friend. And I just like followed his instructions, so to say, right? And so my application process definitely could have been much more streamlined. And the application itself could have been much stronger. But I ended up applying to US universities in the fall of 2013. And just as a result of my poor preparation, I got a whole lot of like rejects, but did get a few admits. And one of them, so Northeastern University in Boston. So their admission decision, interestingly, came to me on Valentine's Day in 2014, right? And where I was living back then, we didn't even have internet. And so I had to go to a nearby, I'm pretty sure this is not a thing anywhere in the US, but in, again, developing countries, you have things called cyber cafes. So there are these local places in the neighborhood where, you have PCs connected to the internet, and you could pay, right, 20 or 30 rupees, so 50 cents an hour to browse the internet. So you could print stuff, browse your emails, send emails, or even play computer games. So you found a nearby cyber cafe, and there it was, an admission decision with full tuition scholarship. So, and that was, that changed my life, needless to say. And this was, February of 2014, and university started in August of 2014. So I used that time to still do research and work in electronics and wrap up any projects that I was working on, but delved a lot more into nonprofit work. So a good friend of mine had founded a nonprofit in ninth grade, right? And he did a traditional, K through 12 path. And that nonprofit, it's called WISE, and it essentially connects privileged high school and college students who have had the opportunity to have a good education and with English as their primary language of instruction, and to underprivileged students, right? So many times, especially in India, you do have huge inequality, and on a daily basis, you would walk by slums, right? So people living in shanty towns and whatnot, and the difference, and you'd walk by or drive by in a car, and the difference is just so huge, right? And you do become a little desensitized to it, but that experience, like working at that nonprofit, going to schools in refugee camps in a stone quarry, so very, very low income and low resource settings, really drove home the point of social impact to me, right? And essentially using the knowledge that I have to benefit society at large. So those few months of having that deep immersive experience in the nonprofit space, it was mostly in education. So we were conducting workshops, STEM workshops at these schools. We are providing these students practical science experiments. Otherwise, they just be stuck memorizing, just rote learning, right? Just memorizing textbooks. So that was a pretty unique opportunity, and that got me really engaged in the field of, and starting to think more about social enterprises, social impact, and mentorship too. And in the fall of 2014 is when I arrived in the US and to start school at Northeastern. My first time outside of India. And when I landed at Logan, honestly, I remember remarking, so my mother came to drop me off. I remember remarking to her, it looks like I stepped into Grand Theft Auto, right? The video game. Like the streets were clean, the cars obeyed all the traffic rules, no one honked, right? It was honestly very, very culture shock, right? So very different from growing up in India. And I hadn't even seen snow up till that point. And that was it's 80, 90 degrees south the years there. Trees are green even in December. Right, you have two seasons, hot and very hot.
Yeah.
In Bangalore, and here, it goes to negative degrees Celsius, 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Took a while to adjust to those changes. But yes, I arrived in 2014, and at that time I was 16. And that was kind of my journey to Northeastern.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really incredible journey. And I love how you really took that step to apply abroad. And you mentioned one thing you mentioned that was really valuable, especially for people my age who are currently going through this really stressful high school process is that it's not like it is like it feels like a competition, but you can still find your own path and do things that are a little bit different than everyone else. But before we dive more into your nonprofit, since I know you have a lot of great things to tell about that experience as well, and maybe even how it influenced your future like startup experience, I just would love to hear more about your focus on like this education. And so would you say that like a main factor in your accelerated education was this like lab experience growing up?
It was definitely a mix of different factors, right? So one was just just that passion for reading and learning. So it kept me reading and learning even in my summer breaks, even in vacation, right? Even when, quote unquote, I didn't have to be reading and learning. So that was one. And the second was definitely exposure to electronics, the lab. And not only that, to adults, right? And like a real work environment. And that to any person, and I'm just using general definitions here. So to any kid, right? Or to any young person, that definitely matures them very quickly, right? Is if they don't, in that environment, I don't think I was ever treated as a kid. I was treated as an adult, like given responsibilities, expected to deliver to certain tasks. So that really, that kind of mindset, right? So maturity, responsibility, I did learn that from that environment. And that I also took lessons from that in my school as well, right? So whether it's, very most kids, I mean, I have a younger brother, I see this, he's a teenager now, and he just goes with the flow, right? Is whatever comes, whatever's due next week, whatever exams like next week, you're kind of just focused, maybe something a week ahead or 2 weeks ahead. But working in that lab environment taught me to plan semester long, right? Or even a year long. And that when I applied it in my school, I just got the entire year syllabus. And I was like, okay, if I'm able to finish this in the summer, then I'll have more free time throughout the year. So that kind of advanced planning too, which I do think kids, they're still developing, right? Their brains are still developing. But that environment taught me that very early on is how do you plan ahead and how can you set up a schedule, right? And how do you manage time effectively? And how do you deliver? What I think everyone learns is how do you deliver when there's a deadline due? So crunch time, like work extra hours. But those were the key valuable skills: is time management, planning in advance. And I could do it more in the lab environment, not so much in school, but delegation, right? Is if you're not an expert in something, ask for help or delegate the task at hand. But yeah, I don't think you can do that at school very effectively.
Yeah,
you can't give physics. You can't give physics for someone else to learn and write. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. I think there's a lot of great advice in why you're talking about that as well. A lot of great advice for high schoolers and people who are trying to develop their skills as well. But if you don't mind giving another piece of advice, I think a lot of listeners may be wondering how they can seek other opportunities as well to, be involved in lab environments, develop these working skills. And so what would your advice be for like how you can seek these opportunities or even create these opportunities for yourself, like you might have had when you were younger?
The piece of advice and is don't ever be afraid to ask for help, right? Or to ask for opportunities, is because very few opportunities land in your lap, right? As people are going to come up to you and literally hand you an opportunity, right? And even when that usually occurs, it's as a result of other, you've established yourself or you've proven yourself in some other field or space, right? And Ellen, you were telling me that your ability to host this podcast came to you, but as a result of other activities that you were doing, right? So if you hadn't put in effort and initiative and done those other activities, this wouldn't have. So usually when people see that, they hear that, their friends have received this or done that, that's typically the case. They worked very hard and created like a brand and identity, become known. And that's when those opportunities come in search of them, right? But usually you do have to hustle, right? And you do have to ask for help and essentially create the opportunity. And I say, don't be afraid, is there is fear of rejection or fear of failure, right? It exists in everyone. But I would say kids are, when we are very young, right? There's a study which said that a 5-year-old asks 100 questions a day, whereas when you're in your 20s, it reduces to like 3 or 5. So as kids, you're like just so innately curious. But as we maybe become teenagers and young adults, we become more reserved, if that's the right word. But that would be the keys. Just don't be afraid. Just go ask if there's an opportunity available. And there are a couple of different ways to do that. One is you could just find areas or topics that you're naturally curious about. In your case, it's Kawasaki disease. In my case, it was electronics. And find where those kind of nodes or centers are, right? Where people are doing cutting edge pioneering work and where you can probably commute to, or it's nearby. So there is geographic proximity. So it could be a lab, it could be a university, it could even be a company, right? Doing research work. And many other institutions, right, do research. So first is finding what you're naturally kind of inclined to, what you're more curious about. I wouldn't call it passion quite yet, because we have many of those, right? So just finding the things that you're curious about and finding the people who are best in class in your area in those fields. And the third is reaching out to them. And you could do this multiple ways. And the most common way is definitely email. And at least for teenagers, a way that might require a little bit more effort would be to create a LinkedIn profile and to reach out to them on LinkedIn. And in terms of emails too, most researchers' emails are public. And if not, there are tools available online. I'm pretty sure anyone can quickly Google for an email extraction tool and find people's emails, not too difficult that. And the third is meeting in person, right? So either you could meet them for the first time in person, either through an introduction. In my case, it was my neighbor, so we did meet regularly. But in that meeting, you do definitely want to make an impression, right? And what we do lack in that first meeting is definitely experience, right? But our asset, I would say, if we have the right attitude, is our teachability, our coachability, our willingness to work hard. And if you're able to articulate that in that meeting is, I'm curious about this topic for so-and-so reasons. And you might invest some time in training me and equipping me in the beginning, but I'm pretty sure that I could learn and start contributing in a short period of time. But I'd say that's the key differentiating factor, is if you are teachable and if you are eager to learn, eager to help. That naivety sets us apart and more than compensates for the lack of industry experience. And the reason I said don't ever be afraid is you would have to repeat this process time and time again, right? So if you're going to looking at a different field, an opportunity in a different field, you'll have to repeat this. If you're in different stages of life, you'll have to repeat this. So that's why I said is, don't ever be afraid to ask for help or even ask for opportunities. Because if you don't, the automatic is a no, right? And if you do, you increase the probability of a yes. So that's the one piece of advice I'd share.
That's really valuable advice. And I especially liked what you said about, not having experience, because I know that a lot of people, if they think that they don't have enough experience, they don't even try or to ask, like you mentioned, because they're like, oh, well, I haven't been to college. I don't have all of this industry experience. And so they never even think it's a possibility. But like you mentioned, there's a lot of curiosity and, a lot of asking questions, and just showing people that you're really interested and are willing to work hard. I think that's super, super great advice as well. But yeah, so I know you mentioned your work in your nonprofit as well, and how that gave you a lot of experience and social impact. So I'd love to hear about, I guess, since I know you have launched startups, and so where did that experience come from? If it was nonprofits or other ways you were able to gain that experience before launching your startup?
Yep. So that did come uh, during the final year of my high school, really. So between the time that I got my Northeastern University admission, so 2014, many people I later found out through that experience were volunteering just for a college, for a letter of recommendation to help apply for colleges, right? Again, we were happy that they were putting in time and effort, but it was just interesting to me in terms of the motivation, right? But then I realized that in order to attract people, right? So if you're doing something just for the purposes as volunteering, or as for lack of better words, as like a social club, then it's fine. But as an organization, right, if you're doing it formally with structure and you do want to create impact, you do need to provide incentives to the participants. And it took me a while to realize that. And that got me thinking into, as how can we improve the current structure we have? How can we improve the education methodology, right? Since I was very, very frustrated with the traditional method of education in India. And so that led me to conducting an impact assessment of the nonprofits' activities too. I was fortunate to get a research grant from Northeastern, and we kind of conclusively showed that our experiential education methodology was way more, and using peer-to-peer tutoring, right, with students in similar age ranges, was definitely more effective and impactful than the traditional method of education. And that helped the nonprofit actually win 2 national awards. So I ended up winning 2 awards from Times of India as the best nonprofit of the year, and another award from the Yuva Chetna Foundation. And the nonprofit also was able to get corporate sponsorship from Bosch and from Intel for certain projects. So overall, great experience, but also taught me, also developed my thinking from how do you create impact or do service as an individual versus creating impact as an organization, and essentially doing service at scale, right? So how do you multiply your efforts with structure, with incentives, with a methodology, with systems and processes? And it was in the summer of 2014 that I really learned that. And where that led me to is in 2015, after I came to the US, is through the Clinton Global Initiative University. Our team tried, this was from 2015 till 2017, for a little over 2 years. We tried setting up an apprenticeship program for in the technology sector, so for software developers from disadvantaged high schools in inner city cities here in the US. Right, we just found that the tech sector had a gap in talent, right, and needed more workers, more qualified workers, and that there were many inner city schools and also schools in rural areas in the US who didn't have a strong STEM program. And to me, coming from India, I thought schools throughout the US were perfect, right? Gold standard. Everyone had the latest technology and, running tracks and golf courses. So it never even occurred to me about the differences uh, in resources in schools in the US. And through that experience, so from 2015 to 2017 to the Clinton Global Initiative University, and with the help of Northeastern. But again, it taught me a lot, especially in terms of creating partnerships and bringing different stakeholders, institutions to the table and having them communicate. That again taught me a lot about how do you create social impact, right? Through organizations and at scale. And at Med6 now, so my medical device startup, all of those definitely lessons definitely are helping me a lot, right? In terms of creating an organization.
Yeah, I think this is a great transition too from, your nonprofit experience to your for-profit and your startup that you're currently working on. So I thought it was really cool how your startup was actually founded at a hackathon, right?
Yes.
I know a lot of people participate, or many people participate in hackathons, but there's, I guess, not as many who actually end up successfully launching a company from it. So I'd love to hear more about your founding story and how you were able to create Med6 from this hackathon.
Yep. So we founded Med6 in the spring of 2019. And I met my co-founder he's a surgeon. So he's a practicing surgeon in New York City at MIT Hacking Medicine. And it was his pain point that our team came together to solve. So there were 6 of us, hence the name Med6. But essentially, the surgeon, he installed a lot of these on a weekly basis. And I'm actually showing it to Ellen here. But it's a drain. It's a wound drain. And a wound drain, to those of you listening, it's a sterilized piece of plastic with no inherent sensing capabilities. So it's essentially a plastic bag, but it's attached after abdominal surgeries. So went to a couple of conferences, spoke to many surgeons, nurses, other healthcare professionals, did extensive market research, and also built out our team. So found a few more advisors, all through LinkedIn, who are experts in regulatory, quality, in microfluidic sensor design. And we also, through that LinkedIn outreach, we also ended up finding a strategic partner, so a large existing medical device company who could potentially fund us for future work. And in that process, we did work on the technical side as well. We built a benchtop prototype. We ended up filing a patent. We communicated with a regulatory agency. And then in the fall of 2019, close to September, started fundraising. And that went pretty successfully, but a lot of effort. And if I remember correctly, I sent out maybe 3,000 LinkedIn messages, got about 600 replies of some kind. Pass, this is not for me, or not are interested at the current stage. So many different replies. And out of that, got about 60 meetings, 50 no's, but we learned from every no. We improved our pitch deck, our financial model, and various other feedback that we got. And we ended up having close to 6-7 investors in that first round. I'll never forget that day. I think it was December 20th, 2019, when, I was still working. I still had a job. I took like a bathroom break. I signed what's known as a SAFE on my phone, which is the investment document. And at 5:15, I refreshed my Six's bank account, and they had wired the money, right? And I just, even till today, right? It just seems I need to pinch myself, because I think it's a very unique. This is something very unique, which I believe only happens in America, where you trust a 21-year-old, right, with $250,000, and who just has a vision, right? You trust him on his word, and with someone who doesn't have a clinical background or medical device industry background, and speaks with an accent. I don't have I just came here 7 years ago, so I don't have a network here in the US. Yeah, it's a truly uniquely American thing, right? So each time I think about it, I pinch myself, because in India, in order to found a business, you need to have collateral, right? You need to mortgage your home, your jewels. So, and here people trust you on your word. So that's the commodity here, which is valued. And there are milestones and people do hold you accountable. But just the very fact that if you have a vision and that there are people willing to take a bet on you and that there are structures in place to enable you to do that, that's what makes this country truly unique. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that is a phenomenal story. And I was getting excited from it too. That it's amazing how through all that outreach and so many rejections too, so many no's, but then you were able to lead that, get your funding and have someone lead that round as well. I think this also goes back to what you said before, is that you should really just ask or try to reach out and not be afraid of the no's, because it's an automatic no if you don't even try in the first place. But I hope you don't mind me throwing a double question at you right now, since I know you've been both on the founder side of things and also as a mentor. So I guess the first part of this question is, what is the most important advice you've received as a founder yourself? And on the flip side, what is the most common advice that you give to startups, or the mistakes that startups are making that you usually advise?
That's a very good question. So most important advice that I've received, it's definitely, I wouldn't say it's advice that someone's told me, but it comes from observation of other founders and, hearing podcasts and reading books that I've seen. But it's perseverance, right? Success is never overnight, and it's a long road with many ups and downs, right? And you always have to be driving for the light, right? So if you're in a tunnel, you always have to be driving for the light, and you should never look back and think that, oh man, look at, I've done all this work. Or, you should, for lack of better words, you should never stop and throw like a pity party, right? You should always be focused on learning, on improving, and driving for the light. And again, this is a very startup founder mindset. So I'm coming from there, right? Because very often you can look back and just think that, what's the point, right? So that mindset should never arise, right? Is lack of enthusiasm or optimism. So that's why very few people become founders, is because you do need to look at the world with rose-colored lenses, right? You do need to be, what's the word? Hallucinogenic. I think that's the word. Hallucinogenically optimistic, right? So any challenge that comes your way, there is going to be a solution. You never take no for an answer. So it's a different kind of mindset. It does take time to develop, right? Because most people aren't wired that way. As human beings, like biologically, we are wired to be pessimists, right? That's what, like 10,000 years ago, the pessimist, the person who ran away from the lion versus going close to a lion, right, are the people who survived. Whereas today we live in much more stable and safe societies. So we do need to rewire our brains to be more optimistic. But that was a little bit of a long answer. But it's being perseverant and driving towards the light and having the right attitude at all times. So a combination of these things. And in terms of what the advice I give to founders is, just learning from my experience, it's find big markets to tackle, right? Because there is such a thing as working hard on something which is going to result in a small outcome. And there is, I'm very certain that the grocery store owner down the street works as hard, if not harder than me, right? But we work on different projects, you could say. We work in different structures in terms of how our company is structured. With technology, you have access to leverage, right? So you can multiply your efforts and your impact. So what you work on really, really matters. And you need to pick the problem that you're solving very well. And the next thing that matters is who you work with. So you want the best-in-class talent. And sometimes it does work out. You could found a company with your high school buddies, college buddies, and you see plenty of examples out there where that's worked. But let's say you are the person that's driven in an environment you're present. It's okay to be a little patient, right? And find the right co-founder or any given role, a right CTO or a CMO. Just be patient, learn that function and do that function yourself versus just filling it with someone who you met, right? Or someone so that's something that I'd recommend to founders is what you work on really matters. So find a big problem to solve. And the second is who you are solving that problem with. So build the best-in-class team. And the team's always evolving. So just because someone is at your stage is best-in-class today, doesn't mean they will grow and mature with the company and be they might. You want to help them and empower them to be in 3-5 years from now, but you might have to find someone else. So you do need to eventually you need to get good at having those crucial conversations as well. Yeah. So again, this is like general founder advice. And the second part of this is specifically advice to founders who are young, because when you're building a best-in-class team, you'll have people on your team, multiples of your age, right? Not a few years older. Maybe the engineers will be a few years older, but your C-level, your executives, your investors will likely be your parents' age or even older, right? So just learning the skills to handle those relationships is very key. Yeah.
Yeah. I especially love the way you put hallucinogenically optimistic. I think that's a very great way, think big, but also be positive and try to aim for those goals, whether you're like a founder or a student or anything. Try to work on problems that are big and dream big. But I'm sure we could keep on going and talk for a really long time, but I think that's really great advice to leave off the listeners with and very inspirational messages for people to be looking towards their own problems. I know I was writing down a few things that I'm going to keep pursuing and, writing down a few opportunities that I think I'll aim for now after listening to your advice and your story. But yeah, thank you so much, Nikin, for coming on. And there's so much great advice in there. I'll need to take a few moments after to digest all of this. But I really appreciate you taking the time to share your really incredible story.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And if anyone would like to reach out to me, you can find me first name, last name on LinkedIn, and just add a note there saying that you heard this podcast. And the other way to reach out to me is definitely through email. So firstname.lastname@gmail.com.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll make sure to link down below your information and your social medias down in the show notes as well for anyone who would like to reach out. But yeah, thank you so much for all the listeners to tuning in to this episode of Delta X Podcast. I'll also link down below the newsletter, which you can subscribe to get these podcasts every 2 weeks. But thank you so much, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Delta X Podcast with Ellen Shu. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.